In this mini lecture, we'll be discussing the 5 schools of behaviorism. And going back to our last lecture, we learned that behaviorism is the division of psychology that focuses on observable behaviors and environmental factors. And people typically refer to behaviorism as if it's one thing, but there are actually several different types of behaviorism, and we'll talk about 5 of those today. Okay, we'll start by discussing Watson's methodological behaviorism. And this particular type of behaviorism was developed by John B. Watson. And he said that, he recognizes that internal processes exist, but he says that we do not have the methods to study those internal experiences. Therefore, we can't really worry about them. So since we don't have a way to study them, we don't focus on them. Watson originally believed that all behaviors were reflexive. So this is an SR theory, meaning there's some stimulus in the environment that leads directly to a behavioral response. So all of our behaviors are the result of these inborn reflexes that are caused by some stimulus in the environment. Watson later changed his view and said that we are born with some reflexes, and we're born with 3 core emotions. And those core emotions are love, rage, and fear. And he said everything beyond that was learned. So he changed his view of behavior greatly. Watson is famous for this saying, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well formed, and my own specific world in which to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant chief, and yes, even beggar man and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race ancestors." So basically, he was saying that give me an infant and let me control this infant's world, control their experiences, and I can make this infant into anything that I want that infant to be. You will also notice that he said, give me a dozen healthy infants well formed. And that was him recognizing the fact that sometimes there really are physical limitations, and because of the physical limitations, there might be certain things that it cannot do. But if you give me a healthy infant, let me control their environment, I can make them into anything that I want that infant to be. And you also notice that at the end of that statement, he said, regardless of the race of his ancestors. And this was something that was brought up many years later in order to refute racist beliefs. So rather than saying that this race may not be achieving as much as others because there's some genetic inborn tendency to the race, people can use Watson's argument to say, no, it's the environment, it's the experiences that cause this behavior. It's not something that's due to the person's race, it's their environment. Next, we'll talk about Hull's Neobehaviorism. And Hull rejected Watson's views. He said that just because something cannot be observed does not mean that it should not be studied. And he said that other fields like physics and chemistry, they study things that cannot be observed all the time. What you have to do is operationalize those things. That means defining them in a way that can be measured and observed. So, for example, can we really observe anxiety? Can we observe what's going on inside a person when they feel anxious? No, we can't. But we can operationalize anxiety and define anxiety as an increase in heart rate, an increase in body temperature, an increase in the shaking of the hands. So those are things that can be observed and measured, and we can use those things to say if a person exhibits those behaviors, we can infer that they are feeling anxious. So again, we can infer the existence of internal events that come between the stimulus and the response. So whereas Watson originally thought that there was purely an environmental stimulus that led to a behavioral response, Hull said that we can infer that there is some internal event that comes between the stimulus and the environment and that behavioral response that can explain the behavioral response. So Hull called these intervening variables. So again, an internal event that comes between the stimulus and the environment and the behavioral response. And for Hull, these intervening variables were physiological. So they were physical variables. So for example, Watson might say you get stung by a bee, which is the emotional stimulus, and you yell, which is your behavioral response. Hull would say, no, there is an intervening variable that comes between being stung and yelling, and that intervening variable is pain. So you get stung by a bee, you feel pain, which causes you to yell. Watson might say you see a hamburger and your mouth starts to water. So again, the environmental stimulus is the hamburger. The behavioral response is you start to salivate. Hull would say, no, you see a hamburger, you feel hungry, and because you feel hungry, you start to salivate. So again, there's an intervening physiological variable that comes between the stimulus and the response. Next, we'll discuss Tolman's cognitive behaviorism. And so while Hull thought the intervening variables were physiological, Tolman believed that they were cognitive. So rather than having it be something that's physical, it's something that goes on in your mind that comes between the stimulus and the response. So Tolman might say that you see the hamburger, you think about eating it, so you begin to salivate. So again, the intervening variable is something cognitive. Rather than you see a big scary dog and you automatically yell, Tolman might say you see the dog, you anticipate that the dog is going to bite you, so you yell. So again, there's some cognitive process that comes between the stimulus and the environment and the behavior that causes the behavior to occur. Tolman also introduced the idea of latent learning. And this is the idea that you can learn something without showing a change in your behavior immediately. So think back to our definition of learning. We said it's some relatively permanent change in behavior, but Tolman said you can actually learn without showing your behavior change. When I think about this, I think about and try to imagine a world before GPS. Let's say you take a particular route home and that route is closed. You can take a new route that you've never taken before because you have a mental map of the city in your head. So again, your regular route home is closed. You have to take a new route that you've never taken. So you may have never shown that behavior before, but you actually have learned with showing the behavior, and you didn't have to show the behavior of taking that new route until you have to because your old route is closed. So that's the idea of learning can take place without you showing the change of behavior. You may watch somebody doing a dance. You never do that dance yourself, but mentally you've learned how to do it, and when called upon to do it, you can actually do the dance. So that's the idea of latent learning. And so Tolman's theory makes a distinction between learning and performance. So you can learn something without actually performing the behavior at that time. Next, Bandura's social learning theory. This theory emphasizes observational learning and cognitive processes. So the idea is that we imitate behavior, and a lot of our behavior is governed by internal cognitive processes, um, much like Tolman discussed also. One of the key features of Bandura's theory is reciprocal determinism. And reciprocal determinism is the idea that environmental events, personal variables, and observable behavior all influence one another. So if you look at this diagram, you'll see that the arrows go back and forth. They go both ways. So all of these things can influence one another. And in one class when I was teaching this, a student brought up the example of going to an interview. So she goes to the interview and she's feeling very nervous. So feeling nervous would be a personal variable, an internal event. Because she feels nervous, her hands shake and her voice is unsteady. So those are observable behaviors. So her personal variable of feeling nervous has affected her observable behavior. Her voice shakes, her hands shake. Now, the interviewer sees that behavior and he assumes that she is incompetent and treats her as though she's incompetent. So now the observable behavior has influenced the environment being the interviewer. So again, the personal variables have influenced the observable behavior. Observable behavior has influenced the environment. And again, this can go both ways. Let's say she goes in there feeling confident, but the interviewer treats her poorly. And because the interviewer is treating her poorly and treating her as though she's incompetent, she then feels nervous. So there, the environmental events have now influenced the personal variables. And because she now feels nervous, her voice trembles, her hands shake. So all these things can influence one another. So before this emphasize the idea that the environment influences our observable behavior. But Bandura introduced the idea that all of these things can influence one another. It doesn't just go in one direction from the environment to the behavior. It goes both ways. Okay, the last type of behaviorism that we'll discuss is Skinner's radical behaviorism. And I will say this is the most difficult of the 5 types of behaviorism to understand. Skinner said that thoughts and feelings are learned just like overt behaviors. So we know that behaviors that we can see are learned. Skinner said that thoughts and feelings are learned behaviors as well. And think back to some of the other theories like Bandura's and Tolman's, where they use thoughts and feelings and these internal states to explain behavior. So you yell because you feel fear. Skinner said that thoughts and feelings are behaviors. They're just covert behaviors. They're behaviors that you cannot see. And because thoughts and feelings are behaviors themselves, they cannot be explanations for behavior. So again, Bandura and Tolman would say we can explain this behavior by saying it's based on your thoughts and feelings and these internal processes. Skinner would say no, thoughts and feelings themselves are learned covert behaviors, and you cannot use one behavior to explain the other. And you might think, okay, thoughts and feelings are learned. How can we? Well, think about a child. A child has a certain internal feeling that can't be seen, but the child um, doesn't want to get out of bed. The child is crying a lot. The child is failing to make eye contact. The parent observes those behaviors, so the child not wanting to get out of bed, not getting out of bed, not making eye contact, crying a lot, and the parent says, "You must feel sad." So now the child has learned to label that internal feeling of whatever he was feeling. He says, "Now that feeling I know now to be sadness." Well, how does he know that sadness? Because somebody observed his behavior, saw the behaviors we talked about, and labeled that feeling sad. So now that child now knows that feeling is sadness, so that what we think of as feeling has been learned because it's been labeled by somebody else. So Skinner said that environmental consequences cause both observable behaviors and internal events. So this goes back to the idea of everything is caused by something in the environment. So in Skinner's case, the consequences from the environment are what cause internal characteristics like emotions and feelings, and also observable behaviors. So again, that's one that's kind of complicated to understand, but just know that Skinner said that thoughts and feelings cannot be used to explain behaviors because they are behaviors and they are learned. Skinner also introduced the idea of counter control. And this kind of goes back to Bandura talking about the fact that we can influence our environment and our environment can influence us. The idea of counter control is controlling your environment to bring about a certain behavior. Since you know that the environment can determine your behavior, you then exert control over your environment to bring about a certain behavior. So this can be something like organizing your workspace in a way that helps you become more productive. So let's say you have roommates and your roommate is always playing loud music in their bedroom and talking on the phone and watching TV. So you choose to make your study space as far as possible away from your room. So it's quiet and you know that you're less likely to be distracted and you're going to be more productive because you are away from your roommate. So you have changed your environment in order to bring about the behavior that you want to see. Um, Another example of this would be people who sleep in their workout gear. So if I go to sleep already in my workout clothes, I know I'm more likely to wake up and actually go to the gym than if I had to go and get myself dressed. So I've changed my environment to bring about the behavior that I want to see. So this is counter control, and this was introduced by B.F. Skinner. So now that we have learned about the 5 schools of behaviorism, we are ready to continue our study of learning.